We have all played that game when we meet someone new, especially a visitor to a synagogue, and we say, "Where are you from? Do you know so-and-so? Are you related to?" And we label that Jewish geography. But that's not really Jewish geography. That's really Jewish ancestry. So today we're going to do something a little different. It's going to be about making connections. And of course, only kind of building blocks. The first person will name 2 places where he or she has visited a synagogue, or even better, if they have actually davened in a synagogue. So I'm going to say, for example, Temple Ner Tamid in Peabody, Massachusetts. And I'm also going to say the Nidhei Israel congregation in Bridgetown, Barbados, which I'll say a little bit about. And the next person has to connect to the first person's one of their places and then build on it by adding to another place they've been to. So they could say, I've also davened in Bridgetown and I visited such and such a shul in Kiev, Russia, and talk a little bit about their experience there. And then the following person would have to tack onto that and add to one. And if we ever reach a dead end, someone will just raise their hand and unmute and talk about a whole new place. And at the end, we'll kind of recap and see all the places in the world and the country that we've been together. And as I say, each stop along the way, say, a little bit about your experience, what happened there, or who you met, or what it was like for you and how it was different and how it was the same. So I'm going to start, and then as I say, after that, each person, someone who can connect to something I said, or the next person will just unmute and share, and we'll go from there. I don't know if anybody has any questions, but I'll say a little bit about my experience in Bridgetown, and then someone can unmute. So before my husband and I moved to gorgeous Sarasota, we lived in New England where the winters were beyond brutal. As you probably know right now, they're having like -11 wind chill up there. And for several years, every February, we'd spend 2 weeks in Barbados, which was delightful. And we found there was a beautiful old congregation that had been founded back in the 1600s called Nidhei Israel. And they had a building that dated to the 1700s and then 1800s after a hurricane had been rebuilt. A beautiful stone building with a mosaic floor and wooden benches and a gorgeous Aron Kodesh where they would have Friday night services. And we would go there on our vacations, and the people were incredibly warm and welcoming. And because it was a resort destination and there would be cruise ships even that would come in, we would meet people from all over the world. And we would daven the Friday evening service, and we'd be standing there and the stars would be out and there would be a warm Caribbean breeze coming in and a little sand on the floor. And that's the experience I'd like to share. So that was my wonderful davening experience in another part of the world. So I don't know if anybody can share with Nidhei Israel or Barbados, or somebody wants to tack on to Temple Ner Tamid in Peabody or add somewhere else. So somebody can unmute now.
Jerry, go ahead and unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. One of the places that I know and love is Congregation Sons of Israel in Peabody, Mass.
I
thought that would be appropriate. My grandfather is the one who built that shul.
Wow.
And it's my grandfather, my father, and now me, although right now I am a resident of Sarasota. So have you been to the Congregation Sons of Israel in Peabody? Okay, it's very nice.
Yes.
It's where I grew up. And at the time that I grew up, it was interesting because women had to always only sit upstairs. Women were not allowed to sit downstairs. And I remember from where my mother used to sit, she had a good view of me. And she was always, with the finger, what are you doing? What are you doing? Watch what you're doing. So that was very nice. Congregation Sons of Israel in Peabody. The other place, after a while, my wife and I rented every season. We hated the New England winters also. We went on Friday nights in Longbow Key. I don't remember the name of the temple, but we would go on Friday nights to Longbow Key, which was very nice, and we enjoyed that tremendously. But that's all. I just wanted to speak up about Peabody. So
Thank you for sharing it, not to monopolize, but when you mentioned Sons of Israel and the women and being upstairs, I actually got to Lane and read Torah at Sons of Israel once they liberalized. So I know it well. So it's wonderful to hear about that. I had forgotten. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Okay.
Jerry. David has his hand up next, so go
Yeah.
ahead, David.
As it doesn't directly relate to New England, but it's an interesting story in any event. I was in a group of doctors who were going to visit Russia. And our rabbi at that time, I was living on Long Island, came to my home and said that they were in desperate need for Jewish items in Moscow. And that's where we're going. Would I take some tefillin, talesim, and some sidurs? He'll make it into a box and deliver it to the synagogue in Moscow. So I had my trepidations, but the rabbi asked, so you do it. We got to Moscow, and the first thing I wanted to do was to get rid of this box. And I could not get a taxi driver to take us to the one existing synagogue in Moscow. At one time had hundreds of synagogues. This was the only one that was permitted to survive. I finally got someone to take us. He said he wouldn't drive us to the temple, but he'd leave us off 2 blocks away. I said, fine. So we finally got to the synagogue. It was an old building, looked like early 1900s, with a long flight of steps and columns. And there were some people roaming around. And I said, I'd like to speak to your rabbi. Can you tell me where I could speak to him? And they said, we don't have a rabbi. We said, we do have a president of the synagogue. So I said, okay, let me talk to the president. So they let me, he was in his office, and I explained what I had, and he thanked me a good deal. And then we spoke a little, and I wanted to get out of there. And I said, do you mind if I take some pictures of your synagogue? He said, go right ahead. And we left. And as I'm leaving the synagogue, someone comes to me and he said, are you from America? I said, yes. He said, did you bring us some of the things we need? I said, yes. He said, what did you do with it? I said, I left it with your president. He says, I'm sorry you did that. He's a KBG agent. He will burn them tonight. And so from that moment on, wherever I went, we were followed. And we went to St. Petersburg. There was someone following us all the time. And I said, I get better protection here than in New York City. But that's our story.
Unbelievable.
Thank you, David.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Sue Spector, unmute yourself.
Okay. I get confused between the iPad and the computer where everything is. I'll follow up on the Russian aspect. We traveled several years ago with the Canners Assembly to Germany and then on to Russia. And our scholar in residence was Stephen Burke. So we're looking forward to hearing him again next weekend. But we went to the synagogue in Moscow, which is now run by Chabad. And we heard a young woman give a presentation, probably following a script, but she was very enthusiastic about reclaiming her Judaism and learning all that the Chabad rabbi and his followers had to teach her. We also went to the gift shop there. This is a modern Phenomena, right? Just like our synagogues here, they had a gift shop where we bought a Matryoshka doll, rabbi, each one getting smaller, but a different rabbi, and a Kiddush cup, which we use today. Another experience we had was going to Cuba and visiting the Patronato synagogue, which is in the central synagogue of Havana. And it too was an interesting experience as we heard a woman and a man tell us about their community. Many of the people, the young people, are intermarried. And I know one couple said to us, well, if we got married, we actually are probably one of the few that wouldn't have to go through a conversion because both of our parents are Jewish. And they run a pharmacy there where we were asked to bring several items, prescription medicines that they would be able to use for their own members of the Jewish community and for others as available. And also blue jeans, because these they would sell on the black market to give them the funds they needed to buy the necessities that they couldn't afford to buy. We had dinner there following, and we didn't know was it kosher or not. But when I saw the menu, they offered chicken, which was unusual, but they had convinced the authorities that the chicken Shabbat dinner was part of the ritual of the holiday. And so while they could not buy chicken on the street or in a market, they could get it at the synagogue. But when I saw that ice cream was on the menu for dessert, and it was not part of ice cream, then we knew that it was not kosher. And so we had fish, but it was a very interesting experience. And they worked very hard to keep their Judaism alive.
Wow.
Thank you, Sue. That was interesting. Does anyone have anything from Cuba? Has anyone gone there? No. So Bethany, someone else should just raise their hand and talk about another synagogue that they visited.
Yeah.
Sue Prohofsky, unmute yourself. And
I was trying to unmute. I have a memory problem because I do not remember exactly where this place was, but it was in the Caribbean that we visited a synagogue. And the two things that I remember about it was the sand floor and the fact that there was a hidden exit under the speakers area that you could get underneath and hide from whoever was making trouble. So I remember that, even though I can't tell you exactly where it happened. And I would say one other thing about Russia. We had some friends in Lafayette who were not Jewish, who made many trips to Russia, bringing stuff that they couldn't get. Blue jeans was one of the important things that they often took, but they did it several times along the way. So for what it's worth.
thank you, Sue. Cheryl had her hand up next, and then Asta.
Sue, was that synagogue possibly in Curacao? Because we visited that synagogue and it's also one of the oldest in the Caribbean. Because it was Curacao was a Netherlands, a Dutch colony.
Well, been there,
possible. We were there. We did not attend services. We just visited it. But we also visited the Toro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island.
I've been there too.
Also has sand on the floor because it's reminiscent of the desert. And they also have a secret passage under the bima, I think, that harkens back to the days when they had to make, because that was also settled by Sephardic Jews, when they had to make a quick escape if necessary. So it's not an unusual phenomenon to have either of those.
Thank you, Cheryl. Esta?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I wanted to talk about, that was Curacao for sure, and I had been there many times. And later on in my life, when I lived in West Hartford, Connecticut, Rabbi Jerry Zellermeyer was our rabbi, conservative rabbi at Emmanuel Synagogue. Later on, when he retired, he became the rabbi in that temple in Curacao because his wife came from Dutch ancestry and came from Holland to Curacao, and that's where they did retire, and he was the rabbi of that synagogue. That's Jewish geography.
For sure. Do you have another one that you'd like to talk about?
I could talk about Ner Tamid. I lived for a little bit in Peabody, but I came from that area. And I have been many, many times to bar mitzvahs, weddings, and so on and so forth, and always loved that temple on the hill. And Bethany and I have discussed it often because we have mutual friends there. And the Boston area was my original home, but I did live in West Hartford, Connecticut for many years, and now happily in Sarasota.
Thank you, Esther. Yes, Leah. Unmute yourself, please.
Okay. Some number of years ago in today's world, too many to remember, but in any case, Saul and I took a cruise of the Baltic. And the schedule, of course, was given to us ahead of time. And it just happened that it was in the summer and the cruise overlapped my birthday. And it turned out that for my birthday, this trip was stopping in Berlin. And I wasn't sure if I really wanted to get off the boat and go into Germany, yet alone to Berlin. But I asked our rabbi, and he said it's important that you should see what is there. So I spent my birthday in Berlin. One of the places we stopped at, which I'll never forget, is the Neue Schule, which is the original synagogue in Berlin, which is no longer an working synagogue. It is a museum. What happened is all that exists is the front facade of the building. During the Second World War, it was used to stable horses. And when the Germans took it over, they had to pour a solid floor for the animals to be on. So they threw all the Jewish religious objects from the synagogue, the candelabras, whatever, in anything that was metal, into that concrete to help make it strong. And what's amazing is, and they didn't obviously know that by doing that, they preserved those things. And when, after the war, and they came to put the synagogue back as best they can, and found that these things were in the floor, they had ways where they took the concrete apart. And that's what's in the museum part, is all the objects that they were able to save and display because the Germans buried them in the concrete. And that was a really neat story and something you'd never think would happen. Okay. Second, what, dear? So, second synagogue in Philadelphia. I grew up in Congregation Emmanuel in North Broad Street. And at that synagogue also, women, there was not a mechitza because it was a conservative shul, but women were not allowed to do any ritual things from the bima. And I prided myself on being the first woman at my confirmation. I was allowed to sing a solo with the cantor from the bima during our confirmation service. And that was the first woman doing something from the bima in that show.
Very nice. Thank you, Leah. Go ahead, Ronnie. Unmute.
Those of you that know me know that originally I was raised in Portland, Maine. Portland had an Orthodox, very active Orthodox synagogue, Shari Tefillah, and I was raised Orthodox. And 15 miles south of Portland is a resort town called Old Orchard Beach, Maine. And my family owned property, we still own property, it's now in my name and my siblings, in Old Orchard Beach, which my grandfather purchased, which was walking just a mile from where the synagogue was. The synagogue in Old Orchard Beach remains today, and it is still Orthodox. They welcome all people, but the service is Orthodox. When they can, they have a minyan. But in the mid-1900s, this was a thriving Jewish community in the summer, a resort community. People would come down, a lot of Jews came down from Montreal, and there was a hotel, the Lafayette Hotel, that had Jewish kosher, was all kosher. People would get married, there would be bar mitzvahs. It was a huge Jewish enclave. There was a kosher butcher and a kosher bakery, and the shul, Beth Israel Synagogue, you can Google it and see pictures of it, was stunning, is stunning. It's just a beautiful old shul, and it sits a block from the water. And we would, Tashlich, we would go walk down to the ocean and throw our sins in. It's just a beautiful old synagogue, and it's designed, the interior looks like the inside of a ship. It was, the motif is to reflect that it's a seaside. It turns out that my mother's grandfather and my father's grandfather, my parents didn't know each other growing up. One came from Lewiston, Maine, and one came from Portland, Maine, co-founded this shul. We're amongst the co-founders of the shul. So, and the shul is now still run Orthodox. Where we grew up, where we summered in Old Orchard Beach, our next door neighbors, their last name was Weinstein. They had 5 sons. So between the 5 sons there and my father, my uncles, and my cousins, we had a minyan just of the men in our home and our next doors. So there was always a guaranteed minyan on Shabbos in the summers. And it's a beautiful, and you can still go to this shul. It runs in the summer throughout, and on demand in the winter, if somebody has a yard site or somebody wants something, they will pull together a minyan, or they call the Chabad rabbi in Portland, who was very happy to host a minyan for anybody who needs something. So beautiful area. Just wanted to talk about that.
Thank you, Ronnie. Eric, unmute and.
Good morning to you all. Esme and I are enjoying this program immensely. I just wanted to say a few words about 2 synagogues in South Africa. One is in Cape Town. I'm not sure if any of you this morning have been to Cape Town, but the synagogue, founded in 1856, is one of the most beautiful in the world and is often featured when synagogues throughout the world are in calendars, and it's really very impressive. But I actually wanted to tell you about another synagogue in Johannesburg, which is equivalent to Temple Beth Sholom. It is a very large conservative shul. But unfortunately now, with the way things have gone with the Jewish population in South Africa, which is now a fraction of its size, this synagogue has now closed down. But it was founded in the 1880s. And what I want to tell you about it is actually very amusing. This story is in books about President Kruger. You've heard of Kruger Rands and the Kruger National Park. Well, President Kruger was known for all his gaffes and all the ridiculous things he said. And he opened this large shul in the late 1880s or early 1890s. He says, "I hereby open the synagogue in the name of Jesus Christ." And that caused a furor. And this is often mentioned in anecdotes about South African Jewry and South African synagogues. So I thought I want to tell you about that. And one quick other thing, I just want to follow up on Leah's description of the shul in Berlin. Esme and I went to Prague. We were there for a week. And as you know, the Jewish life, the shuls in Prague are amazing and were preserved during the Second World War. Hitler refused to destroy them because they're meant to be a museum in years to come. But the old new shul was built in the Middle Ages, and it is really one of the most remarkable shuls one could ever visit. If you go there where they still have active services, you will feel this is how our brethren in the Middle Ages went to shul. It is truly remarkable. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Anne, would you like to unmute yourself and speak next?
Several years ago, Al and I were in Rome. We had a 2-day stop over there on our way to Israel. And we got in very early in the morning. Rooms were not ready yet. So we said, all right, let's see if we can find the synagogue. So we got a taxi driver and he took us to the synagogue. The only problem was it was all boarded up because you had to know how to get into the synagogue because they were afraid of terrorists. Well, luckily Al spoke enough French to speak to a guard who understood him, although he spoke mainly Italian, he understood his French, and took us to the entrance. We had a wonderful tour. It's an absolutely amazing synagogue in Rome. Also where women sat upstairs and men downstairs, but the acoustics were incredible. And we had this great tour. We saw all the different sites. In fact, we visited the gift shop because a rabbi friend of ours had said, if you get to the synagogue in Rome, I'd like to Torah because I have 2 bar mitzvahs coming up, and the ones at the synagogue in Rome are absolutely magnificent. We found those. So we're ready to go back to the hotel, and we were standing outside deciding which way to get a cab to go back. And this gentleman approached us, and he said, "My name is Angelo. I used to work at the synagogue and be a tour guide, but now I'm not working there anymore. Would you like a tour of the old ghetto?" And I was a little bit nervous because, just somebody approached us on the street, and I wasn't ready, to just go with someone. Al said, "Look, we're walking. We don't like it. We could scream, we could run, but, let's go." Well, he gave us his little card, and his name was Angelo. I don't remember the last name, but it had a menorah on it, and it said tour guide. And we walked into the ghetto, and everybody knew him. They all greeted him with, "Good morning, Angelo. Good morning, Angelo." And we had the most fantastic tour. And he wouldn't, we offered him money for the tour. He said, "Oh, no, but he'll take you to this great restaurant." So as Sue said before, you don't know whether it's kosher or not, but we went, and right on the outside of the restaurant was the Teudah, the certificate of kashrut. So we said, okay. For the first time in my life, I had lasagna in a restaurant outside. It was great. And then they gave us this, he found out that we were, tourists, and he made up this whole appetizer platter for us because we didn't know what to try first. And we had the greatest artichokes and everything. And it was the most fantastic tour. And then we went into the gift shop, and the only thing we could find in there that wasn't made in Israel was a blown glass Kiddush cup, which we wrapped very carefully, and we brought back it went from Rome to Israel and then back to the States. And we have it down here in Florida because we thought it was a nice place to have it. So that was certainly, something very different.
Thank you, Anne. Who would like to tell about their synagogue next, their synagogue experience? Hannah, unmute yourself. Randy, I'll call on you next, okay? Hannah, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, unmuted. We went, we took a cruise up the East Coast and wound up in Nova Scotia. And we went to the synagogue there, which was quite interesting. But the congregation was changing and the building was being sold. And unfortunately, they were taking over a funeral home to convert into a synagogue. But I was still inside talking to people, and John was outside, and he was talking to somebody, and he said, well, how do you get kosher food? And is there a kosher bakery? And they said, not here, everything gets flown in. And she started talking about where she originally came from. And it turned out she was a very close friend of one of my cousins, because when she started talking about bakeries, I said, oh, I had a lot of family who were bakers. And we started talking and we found this connection. But the other place we had been, not to synagogue, but we managed to visit, was the synagogue in Charleston. We had been there and we missed we weren't there when there were services, but we walked in and I saw the place, and I walked into their Judaica shop and I looked around and I said, because this was at a point where I had just been asked to take on the Judaica shop. And I walked around and I looked at this and I talked to the woman who happened to be the chair running it. And I went, okay, I can come back and do this. Now, I did not grow up in an Orthodox synagogue. Belrose Jewish Center was one that did not exist until about 1954. We moved to the area in 52. So it was everybody who lived there who said, we need a synagogue. And the first thing they built was the lower level, or the basement, so to speak, until they could raise funds to build the synagogue. But we always had rabbis who came from an Orthodox bent, and women were not allowed on the bima. And it took a very long time for women to become part of the service, even though there was no mehitza and they weren't confined to the balcony. It wasn't happening. So, and the name of the temple on Longboat is Temple Israel. And when we went to Pennsylvania, we were members of Temple Israel of the Poconos. And in conversation with Marty Cohn's sister, we found out, this is after we came here and were snowbirding, we found out that we had mutual friends from the Pocono area. So you just start talking about your synagogue and where you are, and you find connections. It's very interesting.
Thank you, Hannah. I'm going to call on Randy next.
Mara's going to talk.
Move over. Well, we've been to some of the synagogues that have been mentioned already in Prague, and in Newport and some of the other places, because I like to try to visit synagogues wherever we're traveling. Randy and I had an interesting experience when we were in Provence in 2010. We had gone to Carpentras for their market, and had been shopping, and then we were wandering around the town and stumbled across a tiny little synagogue you would almost miss it because there was really nothing outside that would indicate it was a synagogue. It was in an 18th century building, but I noticed that it was a synagogue, and I could read enough French to figure out that you could visit. So we knock on the door, and this little tiny lady answers, and she looks at us very suspiciously. We tried to communicate with her, and she realized that we were Jews. So she was happy to let us in to see the synagogue. And she didn't speak a lot of English, but she did take us around. It was a Sephardic synagogue. It was very, very old. The congregation was medieval. But of course, this incarnation of the building was from the 18th century. The Torahs were very, very old. She opened the ark for us so we could see the scrolls and the beautiful cases. And the accoutrements were mostly from the 18th and the 17th century. So, and there were little cards in English that could, tell us a bit about the history. They weren't doing services the day we were there. It was a market day. So we made a little donation to the synagogue, and she really warmed to us when we did that. And, as we were leaving, she opens the door to show us out, and there's a very big Muslim community in Carpentras. And she, the street is full of people from North Africa, and she kind of looks out the door, and in the best English I heard her say the whole time we were touring, she says, "They try to kill us, but we're still here." I've never forgotten that. And the other synagogues that I want to mention, in 2014, New Year's Eve, I flew out for a Jewish heritage tour with my best friend. Randy didn't want to go on this. We flew to India for a Jewish heritage tour that was led by Rachel Muslea, who's a cantor up, you may know her, she writes for Hadassah magazine. We had a wonderful tour with her. We visited multiple synagogues in Mumbai and Kolkata. Her father had been rabbi in Kolkata for 18 years. That's where she was born and that's where she grew up. And we had services at the Neve Shalom synagogue there. And she sang Friday night services for us. It was gorgeous. And we had Shabbat dinners with congregations there and at Chabad in Mumbai and at Eliyahu, I can't remember the full name, the 19th century synagogue in Mumbai. But we went to Cochin and toured a number of jewel-like synagogues from the 17th and 18th century. They're small. They're all abandoned because the Jewish community went to Israel en masse after 1948. They are maintained by the government. They all have Muslim caretakers that let you in to tour. They were gorgeous, and we did have a very, very old cantor in one of the small little towns who came in and chanted some of the melodies from the services. It was a very moving experience. And I hope when I get back to Israel, if I get to go again, they moved one of the interiors of these beautiful synagogues to the Israel Museum there. And I'm hoping, I must have walked right past it when we toured the museum when I was last in Israel and just didn't notice it. But when I go back, I want to go visit it and see, because I saw the shell of that beautiful synagogue. I'd like to see all the inside beautiful Torah scrolls and everything that they had in that museum. So I just wanted to mention that. That was a great experience.
Thank you, Mara. I'm going to call on Iris next. If you'll unmute yourself, Iris.
Thanks, Susan. Well, there are two things I want to mention. One, I'd like to do a little follow on to Eric's description of the synagogue in Cape Town in South Africa. A number of years ago, I was in South Africa. I had a client who had organized a trip for their donors to South Africa, and I went along because I was doing some consulting for them. And on Saturday, the group was going to vineyards, and I was more interested in the sociological things in Cape Town. So Marty and I hired a driver in a car, and we're walking around in the downtown area. And we walked past the synagogue that you mentioned, Eric. And I looked at my watch. It was about 11:30, I think. And I said to the guide, "Oh, I'd like to go in." He said, no, it's closed. I said, 11:30 on a Saturday morning? I don't think so. And we walked up to the door, and there was a guard there. He said, "I'm sorry, you can't come in." I said, "Oh, really? Do you have a kippah for my husband?" "Oh, yes." And there was separate seating for the men and women. And Marty and I sat where we should. And when we left, we said we could have been back home. Congratulations to the Cohen family on the bar mitzvah of their grandson today. And the Hanukkah party will take place at such and so forth. So, it's very interesting. Just about any synagogue we go into, we can feel at home. I had the experience of growing up in Pittsburgh, but my father's family was from a little town right across the Monongahela River from Pittsburgh, Homestead, Pennsylvania. It's probably best known because of the Pinkerton Guards and the things that went on at U.S. Steel and trying to break the unions. But this little community had an amazing Jewish community. The first synagogue was built in the early 1900s. And there had been some Jews in Homestead before that. But my family started coming in about 1910 to 1913, I guess. And then the First World War, the Bolshevik Revolution and the First World War intervened. And after the First World War, one of my father's aunts had some money and sent another uncle over to Europe to gather the rest of the family together from Russia. My entire family is from the Ukraine. And brought the family over. And I grew up in this synagogue sitting behind the mechitza. Of course, the women opened it. It was just a curtain. The children ran up and down the aisles. It was an Orthodox synagogue, but the kids were always with daddy and with grandpa and so forth. And the synagogue thrived through the 1950s. But with the movement out into the more suburban areas, things really changed and the membership went down and went down and went down. My father was deeply committed to this synagogue. In fact, I have a cutting board on a cart in my kitchen that they put a new kitchen in the synagogue when one of the longtime members' grandson was having a bar mitzvah. So he brought the cutting board to me, said, "I know you like old things. Is this something you would want?" And I did, and I took it with great pleasure. In, I guess it must have been, I'm going to say the 1980s, my firstborn walked into the house with her boyfriend, held out her left hand and said, "We're engaged. And I want to get married in the Homestead Synagogue." Well, I knew there hadn't been a lot going on there. And I said at one point, "No," while her father said, "Of course," at exactly the same time. I turned to him, I said, "Honey, they probably haven't cleaned that synagogue in 20 years. Well, in order to prove my daughter wrong, I took a wedding planner over with me who walked into the building and said this would be perfect. So the die was set. We called the people. They were able to have a minyan once in a while at that point. But I called and said we wanted to come over and see it and talk to him and so forth. And when we got there, he had not told anyone that I had called because he said, if you didn't show up, I didn't want people to be disappointed. So they found the covering for the chuppah hanging on a rusty hanger in a closet. I took it to a cleaner, came out perfectly. The wedding was amazing. We had the ufruf at that synagogue. and the wedding ceremony, when my family came for the wedding, they arrived early. Aunts were sitting in the seats their parents had sat in and crying and so forth. It was absolutely marvelous. And we had a couple of rabbis, because we had friends who were rabbis and we belonged to another synagogue at that point too. And my son-in-law's family are Mexican Jews. And there was a huge group there from Mexico City. So while we're under the chuppah, the rabbi speaks to the couple. The groom's father is pulling on the rabbi's sleeve. And then when the second rabbi started to speak, there were some conversation and gyrations with hands going in every direction. And when he finished, the first rabbi said, "The groom's father has just asked me if I would repeat what I said in Yiddish. I will try. I wish he had given me some warning, but let's see how well I do." And the beautiful Yiddish flowed because the Mexican family couldn't understand the English. And not long after that, the synagogue closed. The cemetery remains a very vibrant, very vital cemetery. I have 5 generations of relatives buried there. My husband is buried there, and I will be as well. But I noticed that Malcolm might be on this Zoom, and he knows a young woman whose family was also from this community, who has done the historical background of this community. They raised money during the wars to buy bonds. It was a wonderful, wonderful group of people. And we actually have a TBS member, the wife, Bernice Myers, Jack and Bernice. They live on Longboat. Nope. Okay. They are still snowbirds. But her uncle, her great uncle, I think, was the shamus there. And we share stories, of Homestead. It was an amazing place to grow up, and happy to share stories about it.
Thank you, Iris. Esme, would you like to unmute and speak?
Yes. When I was younger, I visited many cities, and every Friday night I would ask to go to a synagogue. And when I was in West Berlin in 1966, it was still a divided city and there were no operating synagogues. And Eric and I went back to visit just recently, a few years ago, and it did my heart good to see the Star of David hanging above the city line buildings, where people could see the Star of David. And they were reconstructing the Aranya Strasse synagogue, which was in East Berlin. And in West Berlin, they had reconstructed the synagogue, which Hitler took for his horses, and didn't want to burn down the building because it would stretch to other buildings. And so he kept it for his horses. And they had completed reconstruction of that synagogue in West Berlin. So with times, times change with regard to synagogues.
Thank you, Esme. Anyone else like to volunteer? Evie?
We haven't been to all of the exotic places that a lot of you have. I grew up in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and it's a small city. But even as a small city, it had two synagogues. One was, of course, the Orthodox Shul, and it was called Up on the Hill because the way the city was built, it was up on the hill, and my grandparents belonged there. And I always sat on the balcony with my grandmother looking down on my father and my grandfather. But I think like when I was in probably 7th or 8th grade, I kept saying, I need to go to the other synagogue. All my friends went to the other synagogue. The other synagogue was a conservative synagogue. So we eventually went to the conservative synagogue there, and it's still there, but it's very, very tiny now. They do not have, my sister still lives in the area. She lives in Groveland, Massachusetts, also a very small, even smaller than Haverhill. But Jerry, I think we met you last year, and I remember that you said, I think you have family, or it was you that were living in Georgetown, Massachusetts. Am I right? And Cheryl Glickman, I believe, has a son that lived in Georgetown, Massachusetts. So small world. Stan originally worked after we got married in both Beverly, Massachusetts and Salem, Massachusetts. He was the principal of the small school at the synagogue in Salem, Massachusetts. And we were there for several years. And then we took a big leap and went to Omaha, Nebraska, where we were there for 39 years. We belonged to the conservative synagogue there, which is called Beth Synagogue. And then we came here.
Thank you, Evie. Very nice. Anyone else like to volunteer?
Looks like
Lois? Lois, you need to unmute.
Got it. Okay. Alan and I traveled extensively and have had some wonderful experiences. I will tell you about 3 quickly. Number 1, the synagogue in Stockholm is gorgeous. It's built like a boat. So if you ever go to Stockholm, make sure to visit because it's all wood. It's as though you're sitting in a boat at that, which is the major synagogue, I think, in Sweden, certainly in Stockholm. An interesting experience we had was when we were in La Paz, Bolivia. I had read about that there was a synagogue. Alan and I went out on a Friday night to find it. And it was very dark and there was no one around and no way to find this place until we spotted a man walking into what looked like a factory building. We followed him, and sure enough, Friday night services were going on, and it was wonderful, especially because the president of the synagogue invited us back to his home for Shabbos dinner, where we ate chicken soup and matzah balls. You have to know La Paz, Bolivia to understand how really unique that experience is. The Jews that were there were people who escaped from Nazi Germany, basically, because Bolivia was one of the few countries where they could go and get into business and function. But the woman of the house explained that they lost their parents and family in the Holocaust, and they're losing their children because there's no future for them in Bolivia. They go out of the country for college and stay wherever that is. We've had just marvelous experiences visiting synagogues in other places. I mean, I could go on because we've been to India and we went to the synagogue in Mumbai and but this is going on a little long. but I just had to highlight the La Paz and the Stockholm experience.
Thank you, Lois.
All right, well, before we turn it over to Cheryl to wrap up, I just thought we'd take a little tour of where we've been in the last hour, because it's been an awful lot of fun. We started out in Temple near Tamid and Peabody. We went to Nidhe, Israel and Bridgetown, Barbados, and we went back to Sons of Israel in Peabody. We went to Longboat Key. We went to Moscow, Russia. We went to the Patronato in Cuba, in Havana, Cuba. We went to Curacao, to Russia, back to Curacao, to the Toro Synagogue in Newport, to Curacao again, to West Hartford, Emmanuel, to Ner Tamid and Peabody again, to the Neue Schule in Berlin, to Congregation Emmanuel in North Broad Street in Philadelphia, Portland, Maine, Shari to Philip in there, Old Orchard Beach, the Orthodox Shul Beth Israel, Cape Town, South Africa, Johannesburg, the only one that was dedicated to Jesus, the Neue Schule in Berlin again, to Rome, to Nova Scotia, to Charlestown, South Carolina, to Temple Israel, the Poconos, to Caparntas in Provence, to a few places in India, Mumbai, Kolkata, and Cochin, to Cape Town again, to Homestead, Pennsylvania, West Berlin, and Berlin Central, to Haverhill, Mass, of course, to Omaha, Nebraska, to Stockholm, Sweden, and to La Paz, Bolivia. And it's been a wonderful tour. And I'll let Cheryl Glickman wrap up for us.
I want to thank Bethany and Susan for coming up with this wonderful, wonderful idea and executing it so well. And I hope we'll do this again, perhaps when we can do it in person and we can chat along the sidelines with each other, because I think that would really bring a little second dimension to it. I don't know about anyone else. I have a whole list of places I'm planning on Googling when we finish this, because I'm curious to see what some of these buildings look like, although I've been to several that were spoken about. And I think that wraps it up. I think our next major event will be the Torah Fund event in February. I hope if you haven't registered, you will do so. It will be a wonderful evening on February 17th with our featured speaker, Rabbi Shira Wallach, who will talk about Queen Esther, an unlikely heroine. And keep your eyes peeled for additional events that Sisterhood is planning in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, so much. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you all, and we appreciate you attending our event.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great idea. And I agree we could do it again. I've thought of some more shuls. I would be happy to share it another time.
Me too.
I'd like to share what people mentioned places I've been. I agree with
Scottsville next time.
Yeah.
Lots of fun. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.